Okay, so hello everybody and welcome to this latest in the Centre for Book Cultures and Publishing at the University of Reading in partnership with Outside in World webinar series on translation for children. Just before we get started, a couple of things to let you know. This webinar is being recorded so that people across the world can catch up on this if they can't make it due to their time zones and so forth. And also just to ask if you could make sure that you're muted, please. And during the talk, if you could have your videos off, please, that would be really helpful. Thank you. But do make lots and lots of use of the chat. We always love to hear from you, and there'll be plenty of opportunity for questions at the end as well. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Patricia, just to ask her to speak a little bit about the webinar series before we go on to hear from the speakers. Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you so much, Sophie, and thanks to the Center for Book Cultures and Publishing, really the most wonderful partners in organizing and offering this webinar series. This is the 5th in the series, and the series is dedicated to our mutual mission to cultivate deeper study of, education on, and advocacy for children's literature and translation. Our thanks to all of you for being here and for co-creating this really vital and vibrant hub that we've made here with everybody gathering, all of the learning, sharing, and connecting we're doing. Thank you so much. You're making this real. Thank you. I'm co-introducing today in my role as trustee and long-time colleague of Outside in World. As many of you know, Outside in World, OIW, is dedicated to exploring, promoting, and celebrating children's books in translation. And what a critical and rich aspect of children's literature and sorry about the screen flicker. What a critical and rich aspect of children's literature we're exploring today with the G-Book team. The role of gender in children's and young adult literature and how the choices and representations in the books we, mostly adults, create have the power to shape not only children's understandings of their worlds, but their understandings of themselves, of their bodies, their families, their relationships with each other, their communities, and the world. So this is a really important and powerful capacity that we have, and I'm so interested to learn from G-Book how they're examining this and how they're advocating for change. Our gratitude to you, G-Book team, for doing this powerful work and for sharing your wisdom with us today. And now back to Sophie, who will introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Patricia. So we've gathered today 3 members of the team leading the G-Book projects. G-Book aims to promote gender-positive children's and young adult literature in terms of roles and model, a literature that is open-minded, plural, varied, free from stereotypes, and that encourages respect and diversity. And it brings together university specialists and librarians from across France, Italy, Spain, Ireland, Bulgaria, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Slovenia. And you'll learn much more about it when they talk. But our speakers today all come from the Centre for Research into Translation for Children at the University of Bologna. So as we were saying earlier, we're really excited to hear from these guys. We really have been looking forward to hearing about their work. We have 3 speakers today. We have Roberta Pederzoli, who is Associate Professor of French Language and Translation at the University of Bologna, and she's published a book on translation for children in French, from 2012. She also led a research project funded by the University of Bologna on publishing and translating for children and young people from a gender perspective. And that was published in 2021, as well as being a member of the G-Book team. She's joined by Valeria Illuminati, who's a junior research fellow with them in Bologna. And she did her PhD jointly with Bologna and Durham University in the UK. And as well as working with Roberta on her various projects, she has also published a monograph last year in 2022 on the translation of children's classics, again from a gender perspective. And she's also very interested in the field of audio-visual translation and is currently working on audio description for the visually impaired. And last, we have Beatrice Spallaccia, who is junior assistant professor in Bologna, and she did her joint PhD between Italy, Bologna, and Monash University in Australia. And she published the monograph, It's a Man's World, the Wide Web, which investigated online misogynistic hate speech on social networks in Italy, Australia, and the US. And the current foci of her research are on representations of gender identities in American and Italian newspaper discourse, and the translation of LGBTQ+ themed literature. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our speakers. Let's hear from you guys. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. So thank you again for inviting us. We are very pleased and honored to be here. And in today's webinar, we'll illustrate the results of the research carried out by our team, our research team. So. Okay. Sorry. Okay. Great. Okay. So the first gender-based explorations of children's and young adult literature date back to the late 60s and early 70s in the context of a second wave feminism. Among them, Elena Giannini Bellotti's Dalla parte delle bambine was one of the most influential texts in Italy and in other also European countries, like, for example, France. In this book, Giannini Bellotti maintains that traditional children's books are responsible for a discriminatory, reactionary, misogynist, and anti-historical discourse. Despite her criticism of the existing literature, Giannini Bellotti also recognizes a vast potential in books for girls and boys, because these books can, in fact, offer new role models, new types of representation of children, and new educational and social patterns. After this first moment of interest, and despite the publication of some studies in the years that followed, a renewed interest in a gender-based approach in children's literature has developed, in particular at the end of the 90s. Then such interest intensified in the 2000s and is going up to the present day. Okay, in general, many of the studies in this field are carried out in non-literary disciplines, adopting, for example, a pedagogical educational approach. And you have here some studies, a psychological or sociological one, but research has also been produced within the field of literary criticism, mostly in English and French. These studies brought to light the impact of children's literature on the development of gender identity of girls and boys. Much research has focused on the identification and analysis of gender stereotypes that are present both in children's literature and in primary school textbooks. And it has noticed that reactionary and sexist stereotypes still persist more or less explicitly in a large part of contemporary children's literature, at least in Europe. At the same time, all these studies underline the importance to strengthen gender-positive children's literature by proposing books with characters that are breaking gender stereotypes. And here you have a definition of sexism and also a definition of gender stereotypes. Maybe it is superfluous, you already know, but it's very important to keep them in mind for this presentation. And I would just briefly recall the definition of gender stereotypes that constitute actual cages culturally constructed within which the development of individuals is forced to shape itself according to stringent social expectations, which aim to bring the range of individual differences into two polarized macro categories, male and female. These categories are structured in a hierarchical relationship that sees the male pole predominate the female pole. And getting back to children's literature, we can say that in many cases, children's literature has kept in the past and is reinforcing a rigid opposition between genders, fostering binary and conventional models. And here you have some the three stereotypical dimensions of girls and boys in traditional children's literature, but also in many contemporary children books, for example, or especially in countries like Italy, but we could also speak of France. As you can see in the table, in part of this contemporary literature and in traditional literature, we have girls who are very often represented in the indoor, in private contexts, and who are very often represented as passive characters, whereas boys are more often represented in the outdoor, in public context. They can also influence and change the public sphere, and they are very often represented as active characters. In such models, girls are mostly depicted as beautiful, kind, delicate, sweet, fearful, affectionate, so far and so on, but also jealous, whiny, spoiled, and so far and so on. Their actions and behaviors conform to the threefold imperative to be good-looking, obedient, and caring. Female characters' roles are confined to those of mothers, grandmothers, teachers, ballerinas, princesses, fairies, and witches. And they always take care of the house and the family, even when they work. On the contrary, more options are generally offered to boys, as you can see from the table. Boys can be strong, brave, disobedient, resourceful, selfish, adventurous, boisterous, reckless, and self-confident. They enjoy greater freedom in roles and behaviors, which tend to portray them as assertive, confident, and bold. Male characters, instead, perform a wider range of roles. They can be a lot of things. So, for example, dads, grandparents, but also wizards, cops, engineers, painters, musicians, and so far and so on. And when they come home from work, they are tired and they are recognized their right to rest, sitting comfortably on their own armchairs. And we have here some examples. We have here an Italian collection that is very genderized, as you can see. And we have here 4 books who are speaking of going to the nursery and of learning to use the potty. And you can see that there are specific books for the girl and specific books for the boys, and girls are princesses and boys are pirates. So it's just an example. Here you have another example. This is a French collection about the jobs, and you can see the big difference between the jobs for the girls and the job for the boys. And here a third and last example. This is an Italian picture book where you have Polly, the protagonist, the little bunny, who in this picture book helps her mother to do her houseworking. And the mother, the head of the mother is never represented in the whole picture book. So, and I also would like, before to speak of translation, I also would like to tell a few words about LGBTQ plus characters and themes and issues, because we will focus, Valeria and Beatrice will focus in particular about these books. And so just a few words to introduce also this theme. LGBTQ plus characters, themes, and issues have become part of children's books only recently, and with very different time frames depending on countries and sociocultural context. And the United States and France are often cited as emblematic examples of countries in which it is possible to observe the development and consolidation of a queer literary production and then of a critical reflection on these themes. Whereas in Italy, unfortunately, there is a considerable delay in both editorial and critical interest in these issues. From the point of view of the themes dealt with, as well as the type of approach and evolution, it is necessary to distinguish between picture books for kids and middle grade books and novels for young adults. As for picture books, we can say that they focus essentially on the representation of new families, adoptive, single parent, and especially same-sex families. And in these cases, in picture books, gay and lesbian characters are mainly adults and not the children. And since this is a delicate subject that is still considered taboo, many studies have noted, on the one hand, the tendency to make these books into a form of activism, albeit a legitimate one, with the risk of making the artist and playful side heavy, and on the other, the risk of trivializing the subject, ending up consolidating all stereotypes. As for novels, including middle grade books, there are more aspects covered, and in this case, it is the young protagonists of these books who are LGBTQ+. In general terms, we can say that we have gone from novels in which coming out is the focal point and homosexuality is represented as a problem and told in a compassionate way, to narratives characterized by positive and agentic representations of gay subjectivity that redress this history of marginalization. In fact, these novels explored questions of identity and otherness. However, some of them, especially in the past, were mainly focused on the condemnation of homophobia, with more recently, novels, it is about showing homosexuality as an assumed difference integrated and as an aspect of normality. And so there are still some critical aspects in this production, but we can say that in general, these novels with LGBTQ protagonists play a key role in offering support and narrative examples to girls and boys who are processing their gender identities and need characters and role models with whom they can identify or at least compare themselves. Then I begin the second part of my presentation. I would like to say a few words about the translation of children's literature from a gender perspective. But before doing this, I would like to say a few words about translating for children from a social and ethical perspective in general. And translating for children from a social and ethical perspective implies clearly ethical and educational issues, and the necessity to answer the big question, can girls and boys be told everything and how? And it also implies the question of the conflicting literary, pedagogical, and editorial norms that influence the translator. It also implies to speak of the question of taboo issues that are variable in time and space, and also of changes in values, worldview, and inclusiveness. And it also implies, finally, the question of two opposite vision of literature. On the one side, literature as an aesthetic and playful experience, and on the other side, engagé literature engagée in French. And all these questions influence translation strategies and tendencies. The translation of children's literature from a gender perspective is a very recent field of research. And in this field, and about this field, we can say that feminist translation theory and research on gender and translation reveal the ideological dimension of each translation act and the power relations at work when translating. And this is particularly true in children's literature because adults, writers, editors, translators, parents, teachers, or librarians often mediate the publication, translation, and reception of books. And these adults, therefore, tend to write, translate, publish what they consider suitable for a certain age group according to a certain vision of childhood and reading, in turn influenced by a certain historical cultural context. Here you have some topics covered by research in this field. So we have case studies, a lot of case studies focusing on interventions and manipulations in the representation of the characters, especially female ones, which is a sign of a lack of awareness of the gender implications and consequences of translational choices. We also have studies about the evolution of the role of female translators within publishing, and other research about the importance and the role of the publishing industry in reinforcing or countering stereotype gender representations and models through theories for girls, and more in general in children's literature. And all these questions are very delicate, because translation can encourage a non-stereotype representation of gender roles and models through gender-sensitive translation practices. Translation can therefore become a tool at the editorial level for the promotion, circulation, and dissemination of gender-sensitive texts. And I will conclude with a few words about the translation of children's literature with LGBTQ+ characters and issues, which is a very, very recent and very little developed field in translation studies. And it is a very delicate field, because writing about gender identity and minority sexual orientations, I'm quoting Beotegui, procède de la mise en scène de l'altérité, du dévoilement de cet inconnu en nous et en l'autre, unhinges stereotypes and traditional gender roles, the conception of sexuality and family as it was crystallized from the bourgeois view, and it ideally opens the way to multiple and unprecedented possibilities of thinking about oneself, living and relating to other people. It is evident today that the publication of books with LGBTQ+ characters and themes helps to document reality, to fight prejudice and stereotypes, to offer positive models for young people to accept themselves and accept others, each in their own identity, originality, and diversity. And that's why some researchers have spoken, for example, Beatrice Spallaccia, have spoken of a salvific potential of this literature in favor of an inclusive and supportive society. And but at the same time, many of the books dealing with LGBTQ+ issues are so-called issue or problem books. That means that they are texts that seem to be written and published for a niche audience, viewed as problem books, texts about a particular issue that only speak to a specific audience, often with little care for aesthetic and literary aspects, and with an approach that attempts to normalize and legitimize homosexuality, not simply representing it as a reality that in fact exists and affects many people. And that's why translating and reflecting on the translation of LGBTQ+ children's literature in a gender and queer perspective implies going beyond the debate between descriptive approach, how translations are, prescriptive approach, how translation should be, to translation, placing oneself in an ideal performative dimension. This means be aware of the social and political fallout of what is translated and published in a certain cultural context. No. Sorry. Okay. And regarding the translation of children's and young adult literature, Epstein states that the time has come to queer and query translation, which means analyzing it from the perspective of queer studies and using queer strategies to translate texts. Referring to the critical and conceptual notions and tools of postcolonial studies and feminist translation, and analyzing some particular cases of translation of young adult novels from English into Swedish, Epstein observes the existence of two distinct and opposing strategies, acquiring and radicalization. You have the both here. Acquiring means we have acquiring when translators push a reader to note how a queer character is treated by another character or by the author, or they can otherwise hijack a reader's attention by bringing issues of sexuality and gender identity to the fore. On the opposite, we have radicalization when translators remove or downplay queer sexualities, sexual practices, gender identities, or change queerness to the straight cis norm. Okay, so I've spoken a lot. So we will see some concrete examples with Valeria and Beatrice, and I leave the floor to Valeria.
Okay, thank you, Roberta, for setting up the theoretical background of our research work. Before moving on to analyze some case studies of translated LGBTQ+ in the books and also the issues related to their transfer from one language and culture to another, we will now illustrate in more details the Gbook projects. As Sophie introduced, both Gbook 1 and 2 aim to promote gender-positive children's and young adult literature, and they have been funded within the Creative Europe program. And they involve 6 partners from 6 different countries, and the MeTRa Center acts as a project leader in both, let's say, editions of the projects. So we have Italy, France, Spain, Ireland, Bulgaria, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Slovenia. So in Gbook 2, the Ljubljana City Library replaced the public library of Sarajevo. Gbook 1 and Gbook 2 share some common objectives, while others are specific to each project. And the main difference is the target age for the bibliography, that is 3 to 10 years old for Gbook 1 and 11 to 14 years old for Gbook 2, and therefore also the target audience for raising awareness or audience development activities changes. And here you have a list of the audience development activities for both Gbook 1 and Gbook 2. So going back to the main objective of these projects, this is the same, that is supporting the circulation of gender-positive children's and young adult literature at the EU level and sharing the knowledge among libraries, research centers, non-profit sectors, etc. And probably the international European bibliography and the multilingual websites are the most relevant and perhaps interesting outputs of these projects. And in particular, our bibliography is the first European bibliography on these topics. And I will explain in a while the selection criteria for this bibliography. And the multilingual website, the website of the Gbook projects, is available in all the languages of the partner countries, plus German. And on the website, you will find the bibliography, some interactive games that were developed within Gbook 1 and are targeted for 3 to 10 years old children. And you will also find a series of educational material and resources on gender issues. For example, we included a glossary on the website. So here you have some photos, some pictures of the audience development activities for Gbook 2, sorry. And because the main way to involve and raise awareness for Gbook 2 has been I'll go back a while, a writing and artistic contest on gender issues involving more than 260 students in 10 middle schools in the partner countries. So during the writing contest, students were asked to write a short stories on gender-related themes, taking inspiration from the bibliography, and they also had some workshops with authors of children's and young adult literature, and the winning stories for each country have been translated into the other partners' languages, and they are now being adapted in various visual, multimedia, and artistic forms. across the countries. So the winning stories are circulating among the countries. So, for example, Italian students illustrated the Spanish and the Irish story. And these translated stories have been collected in a multilingual book that we call the G-Book book. And this will be soon available also on the website as an ebook that can be downloaded. As the bibliography can be accessed through the G-Book website in the dedicated section, you have here the search mask, which is simple to use, so I will not dwell on this for long. You can search, of course, according to different fields, for example, author, publishers, and keywords using the drop-down menus. And I'll just say a few words on the keywords, because when you click on the keywords menu, you will see the complete list of all the keywords that have been used in the projects, and the number of the corresponding books is displayed into brackets. So this is already quite interesting data, and you can have immediately a glance at the different topics covered in our book selection. And how we selected the book. As for the selection criteria that inspired the bibliography, the bibliography contains books originally written in the partner languages, as well as translated books. And in particular, we focused on identifying a core set of texts which are significant from the point of view of gender roles and models, and then on finding their translations into the partner languages. Each partner selected approximately 80 books for G-Book 1 and 40 books for G-Book 2. And since one of the aim of the second edition was the linguistic expansion of the bibliography to include German books, even though there is no official German partner, now in the G-Book bibliography you will find also text books in German. We included mainly recent books published in the last 20 years that are still in print and easily available, and there are also some older texts which are particularly significant and still in print. We also decided not to limit our selection to some genre or text types, so you will find fiction, non-fiction, poetry, also some theater in French. The aesthetic and literary criteria are probably the most difficult, delicate, and controversial, and actually deciding whether a book is interesting and beautiful from an aesthetic and literary point of view has long been debated in children's and young adult literature, and we do not want to act as judges of good taste in this field. So the guiding principle was to select books that are very different from each other in terms of literary, expressive, and aesthetic choices. They were basically the result of our choices, so probably other people would have made different choices. This is our bibliography. It is not easy to define what is a positive book from the point of view of gender in terms of identities, roles, and representations. Our main, we intended for gender positive books, those books that address gender issues explicitly and without stereotypes, offer multiple alternative non-conventional models and representations for girls and boys, emphasizing self-fulfillment, promoting inclusion, respect, and the valorization of people's diversity and uniqueness. We tried to select books that present many different topics, which are crucial for the education of girls and boys. So you will find books dealing with identities, families and multiple family models, LGBTQ plus character themes, issues, school, careers, emotions and feelings, passions, hobbies, bodies, interculturalism, inclusion, bullying, coming of age, and of course the relevance of these topics is different in the two projects, depending on the target age, so also the target readers. And you will find in the thematic roots section of the website a guide throughout across the books, and you will find, for example, feeling and emotions and other themes, and you can use these thematic routes to explore specific topics. Sorry. The bibliography represents a vast database counting approximately 1,300 books, and so it can be useful also for research purposes. And the project implementation has been complemented and supported over the years by research activities on these topics carried out by the members of the MeTRa Center. And here you have in slide, you have some of the results of these activities. In particular, we listed three volumes collecting essays on the topics covered in today's webinar. The first two volumes are bilingual in French and English, while the third one is unfortunately only available in Italian. And is the result of the Almeida research project funded by the University of Bologna on the translation of children's literature in a gender perspective. The project was coordinated by Roberta. In this and other works, we analyzed some of the books included in the G-Book bibliography, as well as the activity of some independent publishers, and in particular, the pioneering Italian publishing house, Lo Stampatello, was established in 2011 by Francesca Pardi and his wife, Maria Silvia Piengo, to make a difference, not only in terms of what is told to children, but also how. And within an ambitious and unique editorial and cultural project, Lo Stampatello is currently the only publishing house for children and young adults in Italy specialized in LGBTQ+ themed literature. Faithful to its motto, Parlami Stampatello, which means speak to me in capital letters, the publishing house attempts to make complex, often taboo themes accessible to children by using simple, clear, direct language, just like capital letters, Stampatello in Italian, are easier to read. Picture books published by Lo Stampatello, mostly but not exclusively, deal with disruptive themes in the Italian society, such as homosexuality and same-sex parenting. These topics are certainly paramount in the books published by the Lo Stampatello, since it originated from the need to fill a vacuum in Italian books for children, namely the publication of books about same-sex families. However, over the years, widening its original scope, New themes have made their way into its literary production, and more recent books have become more explicitly gender-based, giving greater visibility to LGBTQ+ identities and engaging in the fight against all forms of stereotypes and discrimination, with particular attention being paid to homophobia and bullying. The catalogue of Lo Stampatello reflects its editorial and cultural project, and currently comprises approximately 40 books, mainly picture books and non-fiction. And within this limited catalogue, translation plays a major role, both from a quantitative point of view and also for its symbolic value in introducing some texts in the Italian context. Actually, a glance at the catalogue shows that translation has been essential to its development and to the creation of its identity as a publishing house working towards gender equality, inclusion, and respect for diversities. For example, Lo Stampatello introduced in Italy a picture book that is now considered a sort of classic in the fight against homophobia, that is the Sissy Duckling by Harvey Fierstein, which was translated in 2012 as Il Bella Metropolo. Although most LGBTQ+ children's and young adult literature is published by independent publishers, at least in Italy, some books are also published by less militant, less activist publishing houses, as in this example, Les Papas de Violette, translated into Italian as I due papà di Fiammetta. In this book, same-sex parenting is presented as an issue. Violetta has no friends at school, and everyone makes fun of her because she has two dads. She eventually befriends a classmate, Cecile, who is excluded in her turn when her father leaves the family. This dramatic plot is balanced by the straightforward, clever, sharp, and often comical way in which Violette tells her story. She doesn't feel sorry for herself and shows, on the contrary, that she has a happy and joyful life. Rhymes and puns, along with colorful illustration portraying a smiling Violette with her two fathers, also contribute to a light and pleasant storytelling. The two fathers are not perfect. For example, they give her bizarre hairstyles, take absurd photos to be shown to show them to their relatives, and force her to play violin, even though she is hopeless. And all these makes them more real, more believable as parents. And as readers, we often laugh reading the picture book. In the Italian version, we still find the core narrative of the picture book, but language, tone, and style seem to have been altered. In particular, rhymes and puns are not reproduced, and as in the example, and where, moreover, the reference to the positive concept of folie, we can say extravagance, madness in English, which is in a way the hallmark of this family's lifestyle, is erased in the Italian version, which prefers the adjective ridiculous, thus erasing the metaphorical reference to the eccentricity of the two fathers. Okay. Some of the dialogues, moreover, are paraphrased, and the elimination of direct speech reduces the authenticity of the story. And in some cases, the Italian version also tends to mitigate the emotional tension experienced by Violetta due to the exclusion that she faces. And this is something, this emotional tension is something that in French text she expresses directly and explicitly. And in this example, the metaphor of the stone, caillou, and the feeling of a hard belly is paraphrased by means of a less effective phrase, which seems to be intended to alleviate the girl's suffering. And it's also interesting to note that from a translational point of view, that in the two texts, the two fathers are named differently. In French, they are simply Papa and Papu, so dad and daddy. Papu is a tender diminutive for corresponding to daddy. While in the Italian version, they are called Papa, dad, and Papullo, which is say, an invented form, invented version for daddy. Given the debate and controversy over parenting ability of same-sex couples, using a term that in Italian is not a well-established diminutive for dad, somehow risks taking away the dignity of one of the two fathers. And this is all the more so if we consider that there were other possible choices in the Italian language. Moreover, the father who is called Papa, dad, can be identified as the biological father of Violetta, since they both have red hair. The lexical choice, Papullo, risks relegating the other father to a role that is symbolically inferior to that of a father. And now I'll give the floor to Beatrice, who will show you more examples.
Okay, so I would just conclude our webinar providing some more case studies and examples from queer literature for children and its translation. So as my colleagues mentioned, the production and translation of LGBTQ+ books have a peculiar place within the broad field of children's literature. And this is particularly true for books with trans protagonists. And by trans, I also mean, of course, non-binary identities, gender non-conforming, and genderqueer people and identities. We must say that the presence of trans characters in children's literature has gone through a radical change in the last 10 years in the Anglophone or English-speaking publishing industry. In 2013, B.J. Epstein wrote some of the letters within the alphabet soup of queerness are missing from children's literature. More specifically, there is a distinct dearth of bisexual, transgender, and otherwise queer characters. And today, we must say that, of course, some more books with trans protagonists have been published. However, Epstein's words are still relevant 10 years after she published her book. And in this slide, I tried to sum up the trans-themed children's books, the picture books, which have been published especially in the US, but generally speaking in English-speaking countries. And we can say that there are basically 16 picture books and 4 chapter books. By chapter book, we mean, as you may know, books published for readers between 8 and 12 years old, usually. And these numbers, I just wanted to mention that are the results of an extensive research. However, given the increase in self-published literature, it is very difficult to provide exact statistic, as you can imagine. Generally speaking, in terms of trans identities, most of these books are still represent trans characters in a quite stereotyped way. First, there is a tendency to portray trans subjectivities in binary terms. So usually we find a character in transition from one end of the gender spectrum to the other. And both masculinity and femininity are presented through a quite stereotyped and stereotypical narrative. You may have, if you read some of this book, you may have encountered a trope, which is commonly found, that some researchers have branded as the boy in dress trope. So we can say that these narrative device can be useful for children to grasp probably the difficult experiences of trans children and trans people in general, but at the same time it risks projecting the gendered expectation of the heterosexist society. So very quickly, this is what has been translated into Italian, from English into Italian so far. So we can find 3 picture books, namely a picture book by Jessica Walton, Introducing Teddy, a gentle story about gender and friendship, and 2 picture books by Jessica Love, Julian is a Mermaid and Julian at the Wedding, and also 1 chapter book, which is entitled Melissa by Alex Gino. I will say something more about these in the case study. As for the translation of the 3 picture books, we can say that the Italian texts do not show a strong use of the strategies that B.J. Epstein defined as the radicalization, which, as both Valeria and Roberta said, are more common in books on homosexuality and same-sex parenting. In fact, in the Italian texts of these trans-themed literature, we find a quite respectful approach to the source text, meaning that the original illustrations are kept unaltered, and also the translations of the dialogues pay close attention to the source text. Okay, so these means that the queerness of these books is maintained in the Italian editions. So I just wanted to say something as a first case study on Julian is a Mermaid, one of the 2 picture books by Jessica Love, and translated into Italian as Julian è una sirena. which is a literal translation of the title. Julian is a gender variant kid and also of Latinx heritage. And this makes the this picture book, very peculiar in this field of literature, because it is one of the few examples which go against the trend to represent cisgender male, white and upper middle class characters, as Cart and Jenkins wrote. And so the book of Jessica Love provides a beautiful representation of an intersectional identity, we may say. So in these are two pictures. Of course, the first one is taken from the source text in English, and the second one from the Italian translation. And maybe you can see that in the source text, the discursive construction of the identity of Julian and of his grandmother is constructed by the repetition of the Spanish words, the Spanish nouns, abuela, which some of you may know is Spanish for grandma or grandmother, and mijo, which is an affectionate term typical of South American Spanish, that mixes two words, mi and hijo, and literally means my son. And so it's maybe you can see from the slides, these Spanish terms were translated into Italian. And so instead of abuela, we find nonna, which is Italian for grandma or grandmother. And instead of mijo, we find tesoro, which means literally means darling. And so without, I just wanted to provide this example because it shows how without keeping the Spanish words and so replacing them with some Italian terms, the multifaceted representation of diversity is not as evident as the source text in the target text, both discursively and linguistically. Last but not least, I just wanted to say something about Melissa. Okay, so Melissa is a book, a chapter book published by, written by an American genderqueer author, Alex Gino, and it was published in 2015. Its first title was George, but it was later changed into Melissa because in this way it was used to avoid the involuntary dead naming of the protagonist, of the main characters. The book tells the story of a trans girl who is still in the closet at home and at school. And she secretly identifies as Melissa, but everyone thinks of her as George, a 10-year-old boy. And after experiencing bullying at school, she decided that the time has come to come out, and she reveals her true self as Melissa. I don't know if any of you is familiar with this book by Alex Gino, but in the US, it has polarized the public opinion. So on the one hand, it won several awards dedicated to queer children's literature, such as the Lambda Literary Award and the American Library Association's Stonewall Award. But on the other hand, it also received several transphobic reactions, so much so that according to the American Library Association, it was the most challenged book in the US, both in 2018 and in the following year. Despite being published only a few years ago, this work represents a milestone in queer literature because it was the first work for children written by a trans person. So as Alex Gino themselves stated in an interview, I wrote it because it was the book I wanted to read. I wanted trans voices telling trans stories. Although, as I said, this book is a milestone, it also reiterates the typical representation of trans characters in children's book. In fact, Melissa is a white, middle-class trans girl who, on the one hand, rejects hegemonic masculinity, but also embraces completely traditional and mainstream femininity. At the same time, we must acknowledge that the book shows a desire to overcome gender normativity through an 11-page afterword written by Alex Gino to address the young audience. As we are running out of time, I just wanted to say a couple of things on this translation. So the first one regards the problematic translation of transgender, and the second one regards the afterword. So as I said, Melissa is a transgender girl, but in the Italian text, the rendition of transgender is quite problematic and inconsistent because transgender, as some of you may know, in Italian, we do not have an Italian word to refer to transgender people. And so we use the English word transgender or simply trans, which, as you know, is quite different from transsexual, which is quite outdated today. And it is used only to refer to a person who has had gender affirmation surgery. So within the text of the novel, the translator Matteo Colombo used the correct word, that is transgender, but in the acknowledgement of translated from English into Italian. We don't know why, but he decided to translate trans with transessuale, which is Italian for transsexual. And so there should be a book about a trans kid becomes, bisognerebbe scrivere un libro sui bambini transessuali, so there should be a book about a transsexual children, which is quite different, as you can imagine. And last but not least, there is this afterword in the original edition, so in English, and it is a very important paratextual element for several reasons, for cultural and linguistic reasons. First, as you can read in the slides, Gino emphasizes that George is only one story and every transgender story is different, just as we all are different. Race, money, disability, and other realities further impact these differences. And second, Gino also uses these afterwords to explain how to talk with and about a trans person. And finally, the author presents some useful resources for both trans and cisgender readers. And this information concerns and regards helpline and hotlines for endangered queer youth. So as you can imagine, they're very important. But these afterwards is not present in the Italian edition, and it is actually replaced by a letter from the translator to the audience, to his audience, the young readers, and where the translator uses once again the word transessuale, so it is also quite problematic once again. And this is a pity. When I asked the translator why they decided not to translate the afterwords, he said that this part was not present in the file provided for translation, thus assuming that this paratextual element was added later, perhaps. However, it is a pity, as I said, because it could have been extremely useful and very interesting to try to provide a content adaptation from the, especially from the US Society for the Italian Readers. And so this context adaptation would imply to work on both gender-sensitive language and also to provide a practical information for Italian queer and trans audience. And we just conclude my part of this presentation saying that, as you may know, in Italy now we have a quite far-right government, and it has our prime minister and other ministers as well have said several homotransphobic sentences, or anyway, they have a quite anti-LGBTQ attitude. So in this sociocultural atmosphere, it would be also probably more important to provide young LGBTQ people with these resources. Maybe we can say something about the language. I don't know if I think there are questions, so maybe it will come up in the questions. I don't want to steal more time to the questions. So thank you for your attention.
Oops. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you for such a fascinating presentation and for taking us through your projects and all the incredible activities that you've been doing with Gbook, and then taking us through some really fascinating case studies there, and particularly ending on that one that I think that speaks to us all as people interested in translation, on the importance of language and what happens in translation. So thank you very, very much. There has been a few questions, and I'm sure more will come through in the slides. I think that in particular, we were really taken by the Gbook bibliography, which is just a fantastic resource, and particularly all the different languages that you can kind of search through, which really offers that lovely opportunity to sort of trace translation flows in this field. Anna asked, is it possible to suggest a book for inclusion in the bibliography? Are you open to kind of, is it kind of interactive? Are you taking suggestions?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. We'd be glad to add some more books. Actually, we are working on adding more titles to the bibliography. So if any of you has some suggestions, please email us and send us the titles and information of the book. Thank you. Yeah.
And I also wondered, particularly because with LGBTQ plus literature, I know that in the States it's the kind of the most challenged literature. Are you seeing the same thing in European countries? Is that something you're seeing with the Gbook project, as you're kind of interested in these questions? Or Italy in particular, I'm guessing you must have a similar kind of situation.
So that's a very interesting question, because and the Gbook project is helpful to answer this question, because we paid very few attention to LGBTQ themed books in our bibliographies. But if you search for, we have the keyword LGBTQ plus in the bibliography, and if you compare the Italian books, for Italian books I mean books published in Italy, that can be translations but also originally written in Italian, So if you compare the Italian books with the French books and with the English books, I'm saying English, but I mean written in English, not I mean from all English-speaking countries, you can see a very big difference in terms of number. So the numbers are really different, and in terms of quality. So there are a lot of or many interesting, beautiful, very well written books in English. English is the best language for, I mean, but also in French. In Italy, we have not so many books, and the quality is lower. So, and then we also have Spanish, we also have Bulgarian, we also have Slovenian and Bosnian, and there you can also see some differences. So books in English and in French are the most challenging and the most interesting books in the bibliography. So there is big differences, really big differences, also in the way of approaching LGBTQ plus themes. I don't know if Patricia would like that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that in several European countries, as you probably know, that we have this problem of the anti-gender backlash. So they talk about this so-called gender ideology, and which is quite spread among many European countries, especially, but not always, in Mediterranean and Eastern European countries. And of course, as Roberta said, we do not find many books on LGBTQ issues. For example, in Bulgaria, there are probably no books or very few books. The situation is a bit better in Italy, but LGBTQ plus literature is very challenged in Italy as well, especially with this government, but also before. And so, yeah, we have this type of problems in many European countries. Yeah.
Thank you. I've seen another a question from my colleague Federico Falloppa, who thanks you for an interesting presentation. And he's asking, to what extent are you using, or have you used, the G-Book project in your work for counter narratives to contrast hate speech in schools and beyond? You know, and he's thinking it'd be great to have a joint activity with the network, I cannot pronounce that, Federico, I'm sorry. National network on
we're reading it in the message.
Good.
I think it would be great. I think we are all familiar with Federico Falloppa's work, so it would be a pleasure for us to work together with the Rete Nazionale per il Contrasto ai Discorsi e ai Crimini d'Odio. And so maybe we can keep in touch. So we can organize some more activities, because we tried, for example, in Forlì to use our resources to counter hate speech in schools, but there is so much work to do. So it would be great. Thank you, Federico.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm now getting that's right. So yes, I think Anna was talking about the book that she wanted to suggest was a Hungarian one that was shredded on Facebook by a far-right politician, which is now in English translation as a fairy tale for everyone. I don't know if that sounds like a really interesting example.
Yeah, I think the author or the person in charge of the project, she emailed us a few days ago. I don't know if she's here because she said that she couldn't follow the whole webinar, but she told us that it's going to be published. It was translated into Italian, and they're going to publish the Italian edition or version in May. And so, yeah, we are going to upload this book in our bibliography too. Thank you, Anna.
Okay, I think unless my student Emma can Yes, we have a question from Jacqueline Reed Walsh, who asked, she's intrigued by the student-created books that you're working on, and would really love to learn a bit more about that, please.
Okay. So yes, the contest was organized in 2 phases. So the first one was the writing contest, and as I said, there were different workshops with authors of children's literature, hopefully already working on gender issues, so they can help students to think about a gender positive, a gender sensitive story. And these workshops with the authors were preceded by some workshops about the project and to raise awareness about gender issues in children's literature, to help students develop say, critical thinking about gender issues. So the workshop by the staff working on the G-Book projects in the different countries, then a set of workshops with the authors, and then they created their own short stories. For example, in Italy, there were 3 classes involved in 2 different schools, and they wrote, I think, 20 short stories, more or less. And then there was the selection process to establish the winning stories. So, for example, in Italy, we involved also authors, people, experts in children's and young adult literature. And so this was this selection process in Italy. Each country had its own way of conducting the workshops and also selecting the winning stories. And then they were, as I said, translated into all the partners' languages. So in English, Italian, French, Spanish, Slovenian and Bulgarian, that's all. And they were collected in this multilingual book, and now there are different students from different countries are adapting them, and this was also a way to let students discover what their peers in other countries wrote on these topics, and also a way to let them get to know other different points of view, different perspectives, different stories. And the results were also quite different across the countries. For example, the Irish story was about LGBT Q+ characters, and it was a love story. The Spanish one again was about LGBT+ themes
with a trans character.
Okay. The Italian one is a bit intersectional, let's say,
but racism and gender, more racism and gender.
The French one is about school. So a young girl wants to go to school, but she's struggling with going to school. The Slovenian one is
off topic, off topic. And the Bulgarian one completely off topic. And
that's interesting because the Bulgarian one is centered on family, the importance of
family. So, but the PDF will be soon available on the website, so everybody will can read the stories, and And we will also upload on the website the illustrations, because we had other workshops for illustrating the stories, and every country illustrated 1 or 2 stories from the other countries. So there was a crossing of stories and these illustrations are also very nice and interesting. But for at the moment we only saw the Italian ones. So we will see the other illustrations.
Oh, fantastic. I'll really look forward to seeing that. Yeah. And like Jacqueline said, exactly the same. We'll be looking forward to seeing that on the website. And it sounds
Thank you very much. It's fascinating.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
I don't think we have any more questions for the moment. So I'll above all, I wanted to say thank you very, very much for agreeing to do this in English for us. I really wanted your work and your talk to reach our sort of English-speaking audience, and I asked you to do this, and I think you've been great, and thank you so much for doing that. And we've had lots of people saying thank you for the talk, and thank you to everyone for joining. It's been really lovely to see you all again, and hey, Patricia.
Just a thank you from Outside In World too for this amazing presentation and just the brilliant teamwork. So that was so rich and really a model for how like presenting as a team as well as working across your different countries and languages. So thank you for doing radical work and also modeling what radical work looks like as a team. So much gratitude. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure.
Lovely. And I will just say when I upload the recording to YouTube, we'll be adding a bibliography. The team have promised us to put together the bibliography with lots of open access resources for you all to find. I think there's so much in there that I'm sure will be really useful and interesting to everyone. So thank you very much. I'll send you the recording very soon. And thank you once again, one and all. Have a lovely evening or whatever time of day it is where you are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And congratulations on a fantastic project. Thank you. We'll end it in a few minutes.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. See you
Bye.
soon.
We need more independent militant bookshops. I loved that.
Yeah.
Everything, some of the things that come from Italian to English are just impossible. They're impossibly good, right? And so thank you for all the richness, the linguistic richness of the presentation as well. A lot of that was really transformative. Cage, that was transformative, and yeah, independent militant bookshops forever. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Thank you.
See you soon.
See you
Bye.
soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Bye, Patricia.